All right, well, welcome back everybody to a brand new one of these. This is a podcast episode, so it will be mostly audio intensive. There will be a screen recording playing as a backdrop, and occasionally whenever certain specific figures are cited, screenshots of data displays may come up, or oil production graphs and charts. But otherwise this will be primarily audio, so feel free to listen while doing something else or working on something. Multitask. It's time to ramble on about some natural resource issues again. This time specifically, since it's been about half a year since the last one, we're going to specifically be doing a world oil situation episode. And we have no shortage of new developments worldwide to actually talk about. So, namely, to start with, the biggest one probably everyone already knows about, is the OPEC production cuts that they implemented at the start of this year, and most of them have held to, drawing back the total global oil production rate by a little over 1 million barrels per day. As before they implemented the production cuts, the world was pumping out of the ground about 98.4 to 98.6 million barrels a day. And now with them implementing these production cuts, the world is now only pumping out about 97.6 or 97.4, somewhere in between there, million barrels per day, while the world's consumption rate as of the start of the year stands at about 97.2 million barrels per day. So that still leaves a gap of about 200,000 to 400,000 barrels per day between consumption levels and actual production levels. However, they did not want to actually drag it down to the exact same level because they needed to, leave some space in there for potential unpredicted production shortfalls elsewhere for a variety of reasons. So OPEC's been holding to this cut in their outputs for about a year, and it looks like they're extending it again. They're going to continue holding off for another year or so. Meanwhile, that little gap they left of 200,000 to 400,000 barrels a day has actually found its use, as we've been beginning to see some supply issues elsewhere coming up, or rather some supply issues continuing that were already there. Namely, one of the big ones I'm going to bring up is the issue down in Venezuela, where, as I've said before, in the country, a lot of the stuff is state-owned, including the oil and gas industry, and thus that means it's state-funded. However, political corruption over the last decade or so has been getting so bad in Venezuela that all the funding that would normally go to repair and maintenance of active wells and drilling of new replacement wells, almost all of that money has been mysteriously not making it to the industry, and most likely has been ending up in the pockets of various Venezuelan politicians instead. So the Venezuelan oil and gas industry has been running into a consistent problem. Anytime anything breaks down, any of the rigs, any of their wells, any of their pipelines, the funding isn't there for parts and equipment and everything to either replace or repair things, so therefore those things can't be replaced or repaired. So every time things have been breaking down, whatever breaks down, whatever well, whatever field, if it's an entire field of stuff, whatever pipeline, the Venezuelan oil and gas industry has literally just had to leave it. They've literally just had to, clamp the well down and just leave it, because everything's starting to break on it and they can't fix it, so they can't actually pump anything out of it. So because of this, Venezuela's oil output has been rapidly dropping over particularly these last 2 years. It's fallen from nearly 3 million barrels a day that they'd been holding consistently and could have kept holding. However, it's now fallen, as of this month, it has fallen down to 1.86 million barrels per day. So they're officially below 2 million barrels a day now and are still dropping because that political corruption isn't going anywhere. And since Venezuela is heavily dependent on the revenue it gets from its oil and gas exports, as the production has kept dropping lower, obviously their national revenue keeps dropping lower, which in turn makes their domestic living situation even worse than it already was, which the political corruption had been making it worse already because the repair and replacement funds for the oil and gas industry weren't the only things that the politicians had been swindling money out of. I assure you, they've been swindling money out of every other program that exists. So, as they're slowly losing their national revenue from their oil production dropping so low, there's less and less to begin with, and thus there's less and less of whatever was left over that the politicians didn't steal. And so there's less to be provided. Tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of workers' pays are being cut. They're even having food shortages. They're unable to provide the funding to keep their hospitals well supplied. So there's actually been an issue on their border with their neighboring nation, Colombia, where thousands of their citizens every day cross over into Colombia to visit hospitals on the Colombian side of the border so that they can actually get some kind of health care. So basically, for Venezuela at the moment, the situation is getting worse, and the situation getting worse in turn makes the situation get worse, which in turn repeatedly makes the situation continue to get worse. So they're stuck in a downward spiraling negative feedback loop that unfortunately, I'll pray for all of those people, but it doesn't look like that's going to end anytime soon. Which is why so many media outlets have been speculating that there's either going to be some kind of coup or revolution or government overthrow in the immediate future. Now, this leads us into another Latin American nation whose oil production has also just finally dropped below 2 million barrels a day. However, Mexico has been losing their production for natural reasons, mainly being that they've, been pumping oil out of a collection of regular oil deposits as opposed to the massive Orinoco belt that underlies Venezuela. So Mexico climbed up over a few decades and peaked like a country normally would when they're just dealing with a regular set of conventional crude fields. And so they've been on their terminal decline phase for about 2 decades now. And as of this month, they also have just passed below 2 million barrels a day. Literally just below it, like 1.99 million barrels a day. However, this is particularly a little worse off for them because Venezuela, even though they're down to 1.86 million barrels per day, Venezuela only consumes domestically about 700,000 barrels of oil per day. So that still leaves Venezuela with a large export ratio compared to their domestic consumption. Mexico is in not a similar situation. Mexico has a fairly larger population and has quite a fair deal of industry, as not just transportation uses petroleum. Petroleum's also used in a lot of industrial processes, and in particular, nearly 10 to 15% of the petroleum that we extract from the earth every year is actually used to synthesize petrochemicals, which is the broad umbrella that contains everything from plastics to rubber, synthetic leather, wax, medications, disinfectant chemicals, mechanical grease for machine parts, gears, axles, everything. Like, literally the list is endless. Just check it yourself, you'll see. But so, Mexico's domestic oil consumption is a fair deal higher than Venezuela's, though a fair amount of that is owed to the fact that Mexico has nearly 2.5 times the population of Venezuela. But a portion is also owed to the fact that Mexico has a large industrial base as well. Mexico's domestic oil consumption this year has been roughly 1.85 million barrels per day, and their production as of this month has dropped to 1.99 million barrels per day. So their export gap the gap between their domestic consumption and the amount of oil they're actually pumping out of the ground has now shrunken to only 150,000 barrels a day difference between the two. And based on the decline rates of their fields and the projections that you can draw out from that, it's looking like their production and consumption levels are probably going to meet by the end of this coming year, 2018. And then after that, as their terminal decline continues on through time, their export privilege is going to be gone. They're going to become a net importer. And also, obviously, their production is part of the grand total of global production. So as they continue declining, that will factor into the overall direction of the global production numbers. Granted, global output rates are still continuing to climb for the moment. As I've said before, after our first little temporary peak back in 06 through 08, it looks like our second peak is going to come around 2023, 2024. And most of the continued upward drive for global oil production is coming mainly from only a few places. One of the most expansive at the moment is right to the north of Mexico in the U.S., where in West Texas, the Permian shale basin is really rapidly being exploited, as well as to a certain extent, some of the increasing U.S. production is owed to additional projects in the ultra-deepwater Gulf of Mexico, as well as the Niobrara shale in Colorado. However, the Niobrara shale in Colorado is nowhere near as massive of a formation as the Permian shale in West Texas. So Niobrara is likely to peak much sooner and at much lower numbers and then start its rapid decline as shale fields do, such as Bakken and Eagle Ford, both of which already have had their peaks and are on their decline phase. One of which peaked at nearly 2 million barrels per day and has since fallen to about 1.4, and the other of which peaked at about 1.2 million barrels a day and has since fallen to about 1 million flat. Permian, however, has been rapidly expanding, and at the start of last year, for example, was right around 2 million barrels a day, and at the start of this year, it was around 2.3, 2.4 million barrels a day. As of this month, it's somewhere around 2.6, 2.7 million barrels a day, and is expected in 2019 to be approaching sort of the top of the hill, not its exact peak, but sort of the increase rate will begin to taper off. 2019 will be around the top of the hill for Permian, just above 3 million barrels a day or so, 3.1, 3.2. However, unlike the other shale fields, because of the way Permian's formed, it actually won't sort of climb up, peak, and then drop. It'll more sort of slowly crest up, like the top of a really almost flat hill, and then it'll kind of have a much more gradual, lumpy curve downwards after that. And over in the Gulf of Mexico, we're about at the approachable limits, because the latest couple discoveries are literally in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. Because, over the course of the last 50 or 60 years, as we started moving offshore, we start exploring, we venture out 20, 30 miles, 50, 60 miles. Some of the new wells Chevron's been bringing online are 180 to 220 miles out. Well, some of the latest exploration finds out there are literally at the middle of the Gulf. So that's it. It's being approached, from two ends. You have Mexico creeping up northward, and you have the U.S. Exploring into it southward. So, once we reach the middle, that's it. There's nowhere left to go. There's no extra Gulf of Mexico in a parallel dimension or anything, which has also now happened in the Caspian Sea as well. As over the last 20 years, a lot of new oil coming online were projects that were drilled out in the Caspian Sea over in Central Asia. And the nations surrounding it, similarly to the Gulf of Mexico, gradually crept out further and further. However, they've reached the edge of the frontier because they've reached the middle, the center line of the Caspian Sea. So there's nowhere left to go. Another fair part of the continuing increase in global production for the next couple of years will also be coming from Nigeria, at least hopefully for them, because normally for the last several decades they can hold a production plateau of about 2 to 2.5 million barrels a day. However, over the last few years, their oil facilities and pipelines and everything have been suffering constant attacks from the terrorist group known as Boko Haram. And so, with each attack, they'll lose huge amounts of production, usually anywhere from 200,000 to 600,000 barrels a day worth of production has to be taken offline because the facilities that would process it, have been destroyed. And it'll be offline for months at a time. However, since the last attack back in April or May, they've been doing all right and they've been recovering. They're nearly back up to the bottom line of what their standard plateau was. They're just about to cross over 2 million barrels a day again. So, barring any additional attacks on their facilities, they will be able to continue adding some increases to global production as they try to make their way back up to the 2.5 million barrel a day mark. And one of the other primary contributors to the continued increase in global production will be good old Canada, as Canada is now bringing online some new high output projects a couple hundred kilometers off the coast of Newfoundland, as well as continuing again to expand the tar sands out in Alberta. As the tar sands are at almost 3 million barrels a day, and they theorize that they could potentially get the production up to maybe 5 to 6 million barrels a day, which would basically be the maximum they could be able to get it to. However, because of the sheer enormity of the reserve base of the tar sands, they would be able to hold that production level for an extremely long period of time, which is why I'm referring to the Canadian tar sands as one of the oil pillars. As once a global terminal decline phase starts, the tar sands will be one of the few firm pillars of oil output that's still holding. But the tar sands are continuing their expansion, and they believe they'll be able to increase it by another 500,000 barrels a day, up to 3.5 million barrels a day by 2020. And then from there, they're not sure what direction they're going to take it in. It'll depend on oil prices at the moment. And elsewhere, frontier-wise, we are beginning to breach the last untouched oil and gas frontiers, as Canada and the US are holding back for the moment. However, Norway, the United Kingdom, and Russia are going full steam ahead and between them are drilling nearly a dozen different well projects up in the Arctic. So we are beginning to press into the Arctic now seriously, and either next year or in 2019, up here in Alaska in particular, they're going to be floating a rig up here to begin drilling operations for a field that is a fair ways offshore, between 80 and 120 miles offshore. So it's a pretty decently sized field. It's like 22 billion barrels, I believe, up in the Beaufort Sea, which is technically it's the Arctic Ocean, but the portion of the Arctic Ocean immediately off the northern coast of Alaska is referred to as the Beaufort Sea. So we're about to begin joining the rest of the world pushing into the Arctic now. which just leaves Canada, but Canada will most likely be jumping in eventually. And one of the other formerly untouched oil and gas frontiers is now being put under development, and that is the southern portion of the African continent. Now there are drilling projects being conducted about 20 miles offshore off the coast of Namibia, and there is a shale field about twice the size of Eagle Ford in the northeastern portion of South Africa, the actual country, South Africa, that they are considering starting drilling operations in. And several Chinese firms, as well as ExxonMobil, I believe, are beginning to drill some large gas fields off the coast of Mozambique, in the seas between Mozambique and Madagascar, which leaves the only real untouched frontiers left as the South Central Asian area, and by that I'm namely referring to Bangladesh and Myanmar, or Burma, as even though the geology has indicated there could be a fair potential, especially for Bangladesh, no one's really wanted to go and try to touch that area for political reasons, because obviously dealing with the Middle East already is kind of bad enough. Second remaining completely untouched area is the Great Australian Bight, or basically the southern coast of Australia. It's been off limits the entire time throughout Australia's oil and gas exploration, because basically the entire that entire ocean area has been declared a marine reserve. And the third and final untouched frontier, not that I honestly think we would actually even try it, because it would consume so much even of the very resources that we were extracting there just to get them out of there. The third untouched area would be the offshore regions around Antarctica. But like I said, we're probably not going to do that. So, all in all, that's what we got going on. Looks like global production rate will continue climbing upward at a decent steady rate till around 2020. Then it's probably going to start to taper a bit. We're going to hit the curve towards the top of the hill that's going to become the second peak. And then around 2023, 2024 or so, should have the actual second peak, which will then likely cause sharp upward price spikes in both natural gas and oil. That'll spur and encourage a lot of last resort projects and things that we still have not by that time even cared to touch, like the Carrigan Cliffs in Colorado and the Orinoco heavy oil reserves underneath offshore Venezuela, underneath Venezuela's regular oil reserves. Alright, so that's that for the moment. Hope I wasn't too boring. Hope you guys found it at least slightly informative. Please like and share if you did enjoy it or find it at least loosely informative. There'll be links to everything in the description and on the channel page, to my Twitter, my photography page, my Patreon that you can support me through, as well as various sites that I find useful that you can use to track a lot of this type of information yourself. And I will see you all around next time.